Hello, and welcome to the Hadassah Magazine discussion, a joint program of Hadassah Magazine and Hadassah's Engagement Division. I'm Lisa Hostein, the executive editor of Hadassah Magazine. This has been a devastating day with the return of the Beebis baby bodies. We all knew it was coming, but to actually see it and the gruesome way it was handled by Hamas was just too much. It also happened to be my father's yahrzeit today, and while attending a Zoom minyan this morning to say Kaddish, I couldn't help but contrast his experience of living a rich, full life and dying in old age with that of the horrific murders of Ariel and Kfir Bibas and other hostages. My rabbi chose Psalm 6 as this weekday psalm to read, and it really struck a chord, and I'm actually going to take the unusual step of sharing a few lines with you. It's called The Weariness of Grief. Adonai, have compassion for me because I am forlorn. Heal me, for my body is in turmoil, my very soul in terrible turmoil. I am worn out from sighing. Each night I toss and turn. My bed is covered with my tears. My eyes have become weak because of my anger, my vision distorted by my troubles. I suspect we have an extra large turnout tonight because many of you are seeking community, as we often do during times of mourning, as well as welcoming, of course, the opportunity to hear our esteemed guests. I'm not sure how to characterize the fact that we're coming together to talk about another young Jew who was murdered 8 years ago, simply because she was a Jew. I do know that the coincidence is just another devastating reminder that Jew hatred, the oldest hatred in the world, lives on in the most dangerous and pernicious ways. Fighting and educating about hate and living proud Jewish lives is part of what Hadassah is all about. If you're joining us for the first time, a special welcome, and I hope you take the time to learn all about the organization and the healing work that it does. If you're not already a member, please consider joining so you can enjoy the magazine, which is free with membership, as well as all the wonderful programming that the magazine and the organization does. And of course, your donations for both this event and all of Hadassah's work are always welcome and valued. Links for both membership and donations are in the chat box. We welcome audience questions throughout the program. Please be sure to write them in the Q&A, since the chat box is reserved for disseminating information to you. And be sure to stay on until the very end, when I will announce the name of the person who was chosen randomly to be gifted a copy of Ruth's book, The Many Lives of Anne Frank. Now to introduce our guests. Ruth Franklin is the author of 1,000 Darknesses, Lies and Truth in Holocaust Fiction. She's a finalist for the finalist for the Sammy Rohr Prize for Jewish Writing. And she's also the author of Shirley Jackson, A Rather Haunted Life, winner of the National Book Critics Circle Award for Biography. She teaches at Columbia University. Dr. Doyle Stevick is the founding executive director of the Anne Frank Center at the University of South Carolina and associate professor of leadership, learning design, and inquiry at USC. The Anne Frank Center is the official partner of the Anne Frank House for the United States and Canada and operates peer education programs and traveling exhibitions across both countries. A former Fulbright scholar, he's the author of several books, including As the Witnesses Fall Silent, 21st Century Holocaust Education and Curriculum Policy and Practice for UNESCO's International Bureau of Education, and most recently, Exploring Anne Frank and Difficult Life Stories from Routledge. He's the educational advisor to Anne Frank, the exhibition, which is currently showing at the Center for Jewish History in Manhattan. Welcome to you both. I really appreciate you being here. And I want you to both feel free to express any sentiments about today, but I also want you to share with us how you were first introduced to Anne Frank's story and how you became professionally connected to it as well. So let's start with you, Doyle. Your career has focused very prominently in recent years on the Holocaust and Anne Frank's story in particular. So share with us your personal shift toward this field of study.
Sure, and if I may take up your introductory comments, thank you for those. And the Yahrzeit of your father today might be the Yahrzeit of Anne Frank and Margot, and we don't know, and we can't know. February 16th was Margot's birthday, could have been her 99th birthday, and it could have been the 80th anniversary of her passing, and we simply can't know. My introduction to this field, as for so many of us, could not have had a positive origin story. I was a graduate student teaching Latin at Indiana University. And the student who failed my class 6 weeks later is on CNN, and he's a person of interest in a shooting outside a synagogue in Chicago, Illinois. And he had fallen in with the white supremacist cult, decided he should try to start a race war, shot 11 people before killing himself in a gun battle with police. And if that weren't bad enough, within 9 months, a man in my neighborhood went to my high school, a few years older than me in Pittsburgh, did the same thing. Got up one day, murdered his Jewish neighbors, desecrated his synagogue before attacking Black and immigrant communities. And that set of experiences had me leave Greek, Latin, classics, archaeology, and try to move into education, understand how do people fall for this stuff and what can we do about it.
Mm. Fascinating story. And just quickly, tell us how it is that University of South Carolina, of all places, became the home of the Anne Frank Center. I have to assume that you had a big part in making that happen, but it seemed just so.
Delighted to have had a role in that for sure. I had the privilege to do work in the former Soviet Union, and I was working especially in Estonia. But it was those countries of Central and Eastern Europe where so much of the murdering of the Holocaust was perpetrated, and they were under the Iron Curtain for decades. So when they finally got free, their knowledge and attitudes about the Holocaust were disturbing, frankly. And I found that a very difficult place to fight anti Semitism. And of all the groups I saw trying to provide Holocaust education there, one group was doing it differently, profoundly better than anyone else. And that was the Anne Frank House. They had taken traveling exhibit programs throughout Central and Eastern Europe, and they prepared young people to talk to one another about Anne's story. And in my experience, that's how real transformation happens. So I started partnering with the House in 2012. We began doing exhibitions in South Carolina in 2013. Year after year, it grew and expanded until 2018. The Anne Frank House director and my university president made the decision to build a permanent partner site of the Anne Frank House in Columbia, South Carolina. It's one of only 3 partner sites in the world, and we're very proud to have it here.
It's amazing, amazing. Ruth, your career as a writer and critic has focused on many topics over the years. When did you first learn about Anne, and how did you come to write this brand new Anne Frank biography for the Yale Jewish Life series?
Thank you for that question. Well, first of all, and thank you also for having me here. It's such a privilege to speak here tonight and to be together with all of you as we share this moment. And, as Doyle said, this could well be the 80th anniversary of Anne and Margot's deaths. We don't know their actual date of deaths. It's actually hard for me to remember a time when I wasn't aware of Anne Frank, which I think says a lot about the family in which I grew up. But I do remember reading the diary when I was quite young, around 8 or 9, and also visiting the Anne Frank house on a family trip to Europe around the same time. And, Doyle, I'm especially moved by your vision of providing Holocaust education via the Anne Frank Center to young people who can be in dialogue with each other, because, of course, that was a part of Otto's original vision for that building, was that it would serve as a youth center where students from all over the world could gather and have conferences and conversations about all of these issues that are still so dire in our world today. In a way, Anne Frank has kind of always been in the background for me. I think, as like for so many kids of our generations and future generations, but especially Jewish girls, I think Anne Frank plays a really special place in our collective memory. But I didn't start getting interested in her intellectually until much later. And that really had to do a lot with the news that started coming out in the 90s and the 2000s about Anne's editing of her own diary. As the different editions began being published, and occasionally there were news stories that undiscovered pages, previously missing pages from the diary, had resurfaced and were being published. Um, I got very interested in this idea of an Anne who had taken so much agency and, recreated her diary with the intention of it reaching an audience to educate that audience about what had happened to her.
Mm. Well, that actually segues into my next question, because again, as you said, a lot of this has been reported about the different versions, but I would say that still a lot of people, including myself, honestly, I didn't remember some of the details of how these different versions evolved, how they were written, how they were found, and how they ultimately became the diary of the young girl that everybody knows.
Yeah, I find it really fascinating, actually. It's been public knowledge that Anne rewrote her diary from the beginning for at least 40 years, since a scholarly edition of the diary was first published in the late 80s, showing the different versions laid out together. And we know she did this because she actually writes in the diary about her decision to undertake this project. She hears a minister from the Dutch government in exile on the radio call for citizens to preserve their documents of the war years for inclusion in a future national archive. And he specifically mentions diaries and letters, private diaries and letters, as being important documents for conveying to our descendants, as he says, what happened to us as a nation during the war. And Anne, along with everyone else in the annex, immediately realized that they had just such a document. But it's clear that as she started going over it, she realized that the diary, as she had written it, couldn't play this kind of testimonial role because it was too personal on the one hand, and on the other, it didn't actually include enough information about what had actually happened to the Jews of the Netherlands. And so she goes back and literally rewrites it from the start, taking out a lot of that personal information, stuff about her classmates and her daydreams and all sorts of other things um, that haven't really made their way into um, the most popular published editions. And on the other hand, adding so much detail and context about what was going on, especially in those early days before the family moves to the annex, to give a sense of what life was like under Nazi persecution.
Mm. And give us just a little bit more about what happened when the diary was presented and the different versions of the diary were presented to Otto. How did he, the father, how did he then take it and ultimately create the version that got out into the world?
Sure. Well, so we have to picture Anne. She hears this Dutch government minister on the radio in March 1944, after the family's been in hiding for almost 2 years. And she starts rewriting her diary from the original notebooks that she had started in onto these separate loose pages. And she's got all these materials and she's keeping them in her father's briefcase. And then, as we know, tragically, the annex residents were most likely betrayed by someone to the Gestapo. And the annex was raided on August 4th, and the Gestapo arrested Anne, the Franks, and the other family, the Van Pelses, who were in hiding with them, as well as the dentist, Fritz Pfeffer, the 8 annex residents. They were all sent to concentration camps. And during the raid, the Gestapo officer who was arresting them was looking for a place to put the valuables. And he takes this briefcase that Anne has been using to keep her diary and her papers, and he throws everything on the floor and just uses the briefcase to take away whatever valuables were there.
Mm.
After this happens, Miep Ries and Bep Voskuil, two of the helpers who had been Otto's employees who are helping sustain the families in hiding by providing food, but not only necessities, also companionship and news from the outside world. They go up to the annex after the raid to see if they can salvage anything, and what they find are Anne's papers. The diary is in the original form. We know actually at this point that at least one notebook has been lost, but they found most of the original version as well as Anne's revision. And they collect these papers and keep them. Miep keeps them in her desk, planning to return them to Anne after the war when she comes back. And of course, tragically, we know what happened is that Otto Frank, Anne's father, was the only one of the residents of the annex to survive. When he returns from Auschwitz and it becomes clear that Anne and Margot have died, Miep gives the diaries to him with the words that this is your daughter Anne's legacy to you. And of course, not just to him, but as it turned out, to the entire world.
Mm, no. So much has been written and debated about Anne Frank, about her work, about the circumstances and everything. So I'm curious to know from each of you, what surprised you most in your research as you really were delving into your work around Anne Frank? Doyle?
That's a wonderful question. And already there are three things I'd like to follow up with Ruth about. Thank you for remarking on Otto. I was always struck by how Otto never really told his version of stories or his version of anecdotes that appear in the diary, never tried to set the record straight and stayed in the background. Yet he had a profound role in shaping what the public saw. And I think that's something you'll speak a little bit about. The other thing I just realized when you were speaking was that radio broadcast where the Dutch government said, keep your letters and your diaries. In a way, Anne's writings were both. And so something like an epistolary memoir, I don't know how you would refer to it, but it gives us that feeling of intimacy of a diary. And yet it was her revisions where the art was revealed. And that's one of my favorite chapters of your book is talking about how her skill as an artist is revealed in that chapter. And I'd love to hear you speak a little bit about that. I have to imagine that would be one of the surprises that you came to appreciate is looking at her original and revised versions.
Thank you. Yeah, that was a surprise. I mean, one thing that was a surprise to me and anybody who knows Anne through the published version of the diary, which of course we're calling it a diary for convenience sake, but you're completely right to say that it is more of a kind of epistolary memoir, a memoir in the form of diary letters written to this imaginary friend named who she calls Kitty. Um, One thing that surprised me when we know Anne's voice from this document is to see how much it developed and changed over her time in hiding. When we look at the original documents, the very first letters, diary letters, written by an Anne who has just turned 13, there's a huge gulf between that voice, which is the voice of a girl who literally still plays with dolls, right? She talks about her dolls in the diary. She's crazy about boys, which seems to be basically all she thinks about in those days. She's full of gossip about her classmates. And then to think that just less than 2 years later, the same person is going to be writing the kind of reflections, philosophical reflections, thoughts about, feminism and the world and, the human nature and everything else that we know from Anne. It was a surprise to me that she was able to bridge that gulf in such a short period of time. We can speculate about, how writing the diary itself may have helped her get there, or perhaps it was the experience of being in hiding under such, constrained circumstances that acted as sort of a crucible or a cocoon from which she emerges. But it's just remarkable. One of the kind of funnier things that I came upon was a poem by one of her high school teachers who wrote that nobody saw anything special in her as a student. And the idea that, in fact, I mean, on the one hand, we can say, well, it was their mistake. She must have been that special all along, and they simply didn't see it. But I think, another way to understand that is in many ways, she was kind of an ordinary teenager. At least her early diary entries do seem to indicate that. And she underwent a transformation while she was in hiding.
Mm.
That's right. And speaking of surprises, I have an object you might like to speak to, Ruth, and if I can share it here on the screen. You're familiar, I think, with this book by one Sissy Van Marksveld. Would you like to share the surprise contained in there?
I am familiar with this book. So this is, Anne's favorite book. This is the I think that's probably the first book in the Joop ter Heul series. I hope everybody who can speak Dutch better than I can will forgive my horrible pronunciations.
I'll try to pull
Um,
it.
a very, very popular series for girls about this kind of spunky, rebellious girl named Yop, who Anne seems to have really identified with as a heroine. And not only did she love these books, she writes in her diary about loving those books. Her friend Jacqueline van Marzen, who sadly just passed away a few days ago, has also written in her memoir about how she and Anne used to read the books together out loud and act out some of their favorite scenes. And so scholars have figured out that some of Anne's early diary entries are actually written in the form of what we now would call fan fiction, in the style of this novel, where she actually addresses some of her letters to characters in the novel and even sort of inserts herself in their plots in kind of a funny and charming way. So I think that's fascinating. And, one thing we learned from it is that in the first few months that she spent in hiding, Anne was kind of a lackadaisical and, not very interested diary writer. She wrote these entries infrequently. And then one of Otto's coworkers, who was bringing supplies to the family in hiding, brought her one of these novels that he had taken off his own daughter's shelf to lend to Anne. And it's clear that being reunited with her favorite author in hiding was what really unlocked Anne initially as a diarist. From that point on, she starts writing, often daily, sometimes more than once a day. And once she has the idea of writing in the form of letters, when she imagines that there could be somebody on the other end reading what she has to say, then she truly becomes the diarist that we know.
Mm, that's so fascinating. And also, one of the poignancies, obviously, among many, is the notion that people really believe she would have probably become a major writer. Like she really had the potential for being a true literary figure, right? Based on what you're saying, which was developed just within those 2 years. Of course, we don't know, and you can only speculate. But it does seem she had that kind of artistic piece of her to be able to express herself, and who knows where it would have gone, right?
We do. Yeah, I think we do see that. Cynthia Ozick, in her famous essay about Anne Frank, imagines her becoming a great novelist or a great journalist. And the book that I thought about while I was doing research and writing my book, the book that I imagined Anne writing was a memoir of Auschwitz or Bergen-Belsen. And the work that I did to try to reconstruct what happened to Anne in those camps, because of course we don't have any of her testimony. If she made any kind of notes in the camps, we don't know about it. Nothing has survived. We know what happened to her only based on the testimony and memoirs of other people who encountered her there and who remember her. I read During this process, I read a lot of memoirs by other women, especially who had been in those camps at around the same time as Anne, trying to reconstruct, that if things happened to a lot of other women, then it's possible that they also happened to Anne. I don't, go over the line into speculation, but just in terms of trying to reconstruct what life in those camps was like for a woman of Anne's age, of her nationality, I relied on a lot of other memoirs. And it was really striking to me how different the experience of being in Auschwitz, especially, was for women than it was for men. And of course, we know that experience primarily through the testimonies of men. We know it through Elie Wiesel's Night or Primo Levi's Survival in Auschwitz. And started to imagine that if Anne had survived, she might have written a memoir that would stand beside these memoirs that we now consider to be classics. And because of that, the woman's experience at Auschwitz might be just as well known.
Mm, mm.
That's another excellent part of this book. I can highly recommend to everyone the treatment of gender and sex in the camps. That's really quite a valuable contribution. In terms of the direction Anne would have gone, of course, we cannot know. I have, when I reflect on what a social girl she was and how she thrived on the attention of all her friends, I'm not sure she would have chosen a novelist lifestyle, which can be a little bit, socially isolating. But she loved cinema, she loved the theater, and I could see her being a great artist in those areas. So I did want to share one other thing I thought Ruth might enjoy commenting on, but We have a couple of the cinema and theater magazines here, which was one of Anne's passions. And just one detail about Sissy van Marksveld. Would you mind sharing the name of the lead character
Sorry, the name of the lead character.
in this book was
Well,
Kitty.
right. There is a character in there named named Kitty or Katya. Yeah. That's right. Kitty is the name of one of these girls in the group of girls around the main character. Yeah, I think that's a great point about how social she was, and she loved these movie magazines, which I guess we don't have anything quite like this now, but they were magazines with features about stars and also movie reviews. And one of the things Anne mentions in her diary about the persecution of the Jews is when they're no longer allowed to go to movie theaters. She has an account of her 13th birthday party for which her father rents a movie projector to show the latest Rin Tin Tin movie that she wants to see because she and her friends aren't allowed to go to see the movie in a theater. And so it's quite poignant, I think, to think of her reading all these movie magazines, knowing that even if she weren't in hiding, she wouldn't be able to go see these movies in the theater until, the Nazi occupation was over.
Mm.
But apparently, she read these movie magazines from cover to cover every week when one of out of his coworkers would bring them. And she knew their contents so well that the helpers apparently would ask her for suggestions when they were planning to go to the movies, since she knew all the reviews and the plots by heart.
Mm. Wow, interesting. Doyle, I want to get to the center where you are a little bit later in a little bit, but I want to ask the question, there's long been a debate about whether Anne's diary was meant to be or has been primarily used to spread a universalist message about hate and prejudice, or whether it's a particular Jewish perspective that's most pertinent. And it seems that maybe even Anne and her father had different perspectives on that. And certainly as it went on from the diary to become a Broadway play and really has now become like this cultural touch point in so many ways, books, operas, art, the question I think has really lingered. And I think you both have probably a very interesting and important perspective on this. What is your take on this question? Universalist, particularist, both? Ruth,
Thank
you
you.
go first. Oh, go
I
ahead.
really appreciate that question. For me personally, I think it's a false dichotomy. What I find with Otto is that in his family, there were different ways to be Jewish, and there were different approaches to Jewish life. Otto himself, I think, had a very salient German identity, and the Jewish element of his identity was terribly important for him. He said he dedicated his life to his people, and he was a strong supporter of Israel. He would sometimes plant trees in Israel as kind of consolation to teenagers in the U.S. who wrote him concerned about problems and feeling hopeless. Kara Wilson Granite, who had a 22-year correspondence with Otto Frank after the assassination of RFK and Martin Luther King, wrote to him and said to a man who survived the trenches of World War I and Auschwitz, I don't know how you have hope when I have none. And he wrote back and said, even if I thought the world would end tomorrow, I would plant a tree today. So he planted two trees for Kara in Israel. And we're very honored that Kara decided to donate those letters here to the university. So we have an archive of 120 of Otto Frank's letters, correspondence over 22 years here in our archives. On the universalist question, I think given the unbelievable anti-Semitism Otto Frank experienced in his life, I believe, and this is a bit of speculation, of course, that he felt we had to recognize our common humanity first. And once we recognize our common humanity, then we can appreciate any cultural differences that may also exist. So for me, the universal appeal of the diary is a way into the particulars of engaging Jewish history, culture, religion. So I don't find it to be an either or. I can understand why he might have made some of the decisions he did, and I might have wished he had done it a little differently. But to me, it's the universal appeal of the diary that gives us an on ramp to get to address anti Semitism. Because students who come here may not care about anti Semitism, but when they can relate to human beings in a story, then that can trigger the interest that allows us to tackle a difficult issue.
Hmm.
Yeah, I appreciate excuse me. I appreciate the way you've put that. That Anne, they don't care about anti-Semitism, but they care about Anne. They identify so strongly with her, and I think that's a sense in which Otto was truly visionary. In the time, when he started reading the diary, he seems to have recognized it almost immediately for the extraordinary document that it was, and was strongly pushing to publish it, even in the face of some backlash from his friends and other people around him. Editors who he brought the diary to, who said, who is going to read this? The idea that the diary of a girl in this way could become the kind of document that it did is thanks only to him and his vision, and that he always saw it as a document that wasn't a specifically Jewish book but one for everybody, understood, I think, in the broadest possible sense, to promote peace and tolerance around the world. And I think where that idea, that extremely, inspiring and noble idea. And it's, I think it's almost hard to imagine a person with the kind of generosity and open heartedness that Otto Frank seems to have had. Excuse me.
Thank you
Where
for
that,
that. Oh, I didn't mean to cut off. I'll follow after.
but I'll just say that where that seems to run into trouble is when the promotion of the diary as a universal document runs up against, the possibility of erasing Anne's particularity as a Jew. And, I don't certainly, I don't hold Otto Frank responsible for the decisions that were made in the adaptation of the diary for Broadway, for instance, that took things in that direction. But I do think it's unfortunate when adaptations or other creative use, the diary is put to other kinds of creative uses today that don't acknowledge its roots as a document against anti-Semitism.
Hmm.
Otto Frank had a remarkable way. He lived in New York. He spoke English, but he spoke with a beautiful simplicity. And Ruth cited the opening of the Anne Frank House and Otto's intention to have an international youth center. And I wish I had thought to share that video here. It's about 90 seconds. Everyone will find it on YouTube. But soon after it opened, Otto Frank said simply, um, whether we're black or white or yellow, Protestant, Catholic, Muslim, or Jewish, we have to live in one world, and we can learn that we can get along very nicely. And it's only a small part of people we can get here to bring them together. But we must do our duty, we must do our part. And that beautiful idea that our job is to bring young people together and help them understand one another is a major focus of what we're trying to do.
Mm. And, and it seems that whole question about who it's geared toward and who it resonates with comes up in the context of teaching the diary. Now, it used to be that was fairly standard staple in education, middle school or high school education, focused really about the Holocaust, I think, and history in general, World War II. But my sense is that children are not reading it the same way they once were. Doyle, can you tell us about that? Is that true? And if so, why do you think that is?
We don't have ideal data on that. There's not centralized data collection, but the truth is the diary is not an easy book to teach, and it's quite long. So teachers who are faced also with challenges about reading, as well as the plethora of wonderful literature that exists out there, sometimes choose just to do the play in order to encounter the story. And I think it's a great loss, because probably in your education like mine, the diary was the only time in my entire schooling where I read something by somebody my own age, right? It was the only time I was learning from a peer. And that's so powerful because we treat kids like they're future citizens and they'll matter in the future while they're trying to deal with their daily lives. So I think that message that what they say now matters. They have power now. We can help them develop their voices now, and what they do now matters, is something that they need. And I think the diary can help them achieve that. All children today know the negative power of peer pressure, but few of them recognize the flip side, that they have the potential to help bring out the best in one another. And I think teaching the diary is one way to help really get that message through.
Mm. But if it's not happening, what's substituting? I mean, I think it raises a question about Holocaust education in general these days. There are 27 states, I believe. We did a big article about this last year. I think there are 27 states that mandate Holocaust education, maybe a few more that, recommend it but don't require it. But still, the reality is we still have the studies that show that most kids, most young adults, don't know about the Holocaust, don't know that 6 million people died, don't know, who was responsible for it. So you have to kind of wonder, like, does Holocaust education even make a difference?
I really believe it does. I think those of us who are in the field see the impact it has on people, and it's powerful. And the data we try to find to show that people understand the Holocaust, like, can you name a camp? Um, well, it's not perfect. It's not a great situation. Obviously, we still have anti-Semitism, but the work I see my colleagues doing in Holocaust museums around the country, the incredible work of dedicated and committed educators in the field, is simply inspiring. And I'm delighted to be working with an old friend who was recognized for his work by President Obama, actually, Corey Harbaugh, and he was the man who taught me it's English literature teachers who can teach the Holocaust, because they can dedicate units to it when history teachers simply can't spend more than a couple of days when they have the responsibility to cover so much territory. So I really think it's in helping literature teachers get back to the diary, where some of the greatest potential is to tackle this topic with the depth it deserves.
Mm. Ruth, do you have any thoughts on this issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think you make some great points there, especially about English teachers. My own sense is that as a country, we're in a crisis when it comes to English and literacy education more generally. There was an op-ed in the Times just the other day by an English teacher who describes, we've seen this now in the media, I think, for years already, but the idea that high school students in this country literally can't read a book as long as the Diary of Anne Frank. And this op-ed was in the Times the other day talking about how they break up a novel as short as The Great Gatsby and intersperse it with all kinds of multimedia stuff because kids can't read, a novel that's under 200 pages. I think the graphic adaptation of the diary was in some ways intended to step in and fulfill this gap for kids whose attention spans are not up to the original text. And I think, that's laudable. I'm a fan of the graphic adaptation. I think it's really, really creative and very, very intelligently done. But unfortunately, as some of our audience may have heard, it's come under fire from right wing anti LGBT activists who are targeting that book for a single passage in which Anne talks about, in a passage about her developing body, she talks about a sleepover with her best friend and wanting them to touch each other's breasts. And, for this reason, these conservative activists are trying to pull the diary from classroom shelves.
Mm.
I think this is a travesty on so many different counts.
Mm.
I would just like to specify, you're referring to Ari Folman's graphic adaptation
Yes,
of the
that's right.
diary. That's the one that's getting the concerns raised in some states like mine here in South Carolina. The Anne Frank House also has an excellent graphic adaptation of the diary, which has not raised similar concerns. So I just want to be precise that it's one graphic adaptation that's getting the negative attention,
Mm.
and everybody can still be whatever their concerns are about such issues, you can find a version that has a lot of good material in it.
Mm. Well, of course, we know there are other forms of Holocaust education and includes the museums and your center, Doyle. So tell us a little bit about that. Like what is in it and what is the goal? Who's it reaching in terms of educational outreach?
Thanks so much. So, as I mentioned, young people getting to know one another is our purpose. Peer education, I think, is how transformation can happen. So, we have guided tours of our permanent exhibition here in South Carolina, and we prepare our undergraduates to give those tours to one another. So, we have a first year student program called University 101. The instructors are free to choose what experiences they want, but about 2/3 of them have been bringing their first year students here. So every year, we get more than 3,000 first year undergraduates who get 75 minutes about Anne Frank's life story and anti Semitism. I don't know of any other university in the country that's making an effort like that. And I believe it's starting to pay off. And this is our headquarters for the United States. We run 18 traveling exhibits across the United States and Canada. And really, the key with those traveling exhibits is the peer education program that comes with it. We get 20 kids, cross section of the school, help them get to know one another, help them learn this history, and help them learn to share it with their peers. And when I got into this business, my first concern was, how do we prevent people from falling for violent racist extremism, right? I was worried about preventing radicalization in any form. And my mindset started to expand to think about the helpers, for example. We celebrate the helpers, but there weren't enough of them to stop 6 million Jewish people from being murdered. And the fact that it's scary to stand up by yourself means we need to shift our focus away from individual heroes and think instead about how can we develop a shared moral commitment as communities that we need to be upstanders together, because it's only by standing up together that we can be confident in making the kinds of differences we need to make. So I believe that we help to support the growth of a moral commitment, a shared moral commitment to be upstanders together. And then our task is to see if we can help provide students with those opportunities to flex that muscle. It's great to have a moral commitment, but then you need an opportunity to act on it. So those are the directions we're trying to go, to build that moral consensus, to help people understand that we have to stand up together.
Mm. We need more allies and leaders like you in this field. It's so admirable. And you've also consulted and been directly involved with the Anne Frank, the exhibition that
That's right.
opened last month in New York City. And by the way, presumably had a run through April and immediately sold out and now has extended it through October. So that's very interesting. And I know there are a lot of educational components of that as well. What's your role in that?
We're the educational partner. So, as the official partner for the Anne Frank House in the United States and Canada, this exhibit, which includes more than 100 artifacts from Amsterdam that they simply can't show at the Anne Frank House, they don't have the space and capacity. People are flying from the Netherlands to New York to see this collection, and it's extraordinary. It was a pleasure and a privilege to be involved. We're developing the curriculum to go with it. And that's going to be made publicly available. It's customized for this exhibit, but it's also standalone material, and that'll be rolling out on the exhibition website as well as from our USC website. So folks who are interested in those materials can come to us. We have preparatory lessons for people before they go so they can get the most out of the exhibit. And then we're building a series of extension lessons on issues like, why do people help? What is this anti-Semitism and where does it come from? What happened after the Holocaust and the continuing anti-Semitism, including people challenging the validity of the diary itself? So there's a lot of history more to tell, as Ruth's book helps us to appreciate.
Mm. Ruth, I think you had an event at the Center for Jewish History about your book. What's your sense of seeing that? And again, I know it's different in that it does have items. The annex in Amsterdam is completely unfurnished, and that's a big difference, right, between what's there and what's here in New York, which is again generating discussion, right? Is that a good way to go? Is that a bad way to go? Is it, does it trivialize it in any way? Does it somehow take away? But I imagine there are all different ways to display this kind of thing. Ruth, what was your impression?
Well, I think the exhibit is really beautifully done. I mean, you're right. It's not the same experience as visiting the annex in Amsterdam, for the reasons you mentioned. The annex is empty. It's unfurnished. It's not empty. It's crowded with people from morning to night. Um, but what strikes me, another of the surprises we could say when I was researching my book was finding that the house itself became a kind of spontaneous pilgrimage place for people. After the diary was published, readers would simply show up there at the address, which then at that point still housed Otto's business. And his coworkers, who were of course the former helpers, would sometimes just show people around if they had the free time. And so there's always been this desire, I think, for people to want to be close to Anne by inhabiting that space, right? Readers feel such a direct connection with her. They want to share her experience in whatever way is possible. And for so many people, it's not possible to fly to Amsterdam to see the Anne Frank house, for reasons of cost, for reasons of disabled accessibility. It's not accessible to the disabled. And so I think it's incredible that Doyle, your organization, has partnered with this and the Anne Frank House in bringing this experience to New York, where many, many people who would otherwise have been unable to encounter Anne in this way will get to experience something of what that's like. I hope they all also read the diary because that's an important part of it. I was surprised also to find out how many visitors to the Anne Frank house actually haven't read the diary. That's not what's driving them there. It's just the idea of Anne Frank, which has at this point kind of transcended the diary into all kinds of other forms of popular culture. But I hope that visiting the exhibit will inspire them to go back to the diary itself.
That's right. That's what it's all about. I think the exhibit is doing that. I think your book will do that. I highly expect your readers to go back and appreciate the diary with new eyes. And I just wanted to follow that question because you read an amazing amount of literature. I learned things that I didn't know yet from your book, which I appreciated greatly. I was curious about which secondary source you got the most out of. So when this audience finishes reading your book and the diary, what would you recommend as the source you got out of it? And in tandem with that, I'd like to ask, what was your favorite representation of Anne in the form of the arts? Maybe Ari Folman or a movie, or I'd love to hear about that too.
Well, thank you so much for saying that. I'm so flattered to think that my book could have taught you something about Anne Frank. I did a lot of research, especially into the circumstances around the Holocaust in the Netherlands. And I would say, we talked a little bit about the experiences of women in the Holocaust, and I found a lot of those books very, very valuable and, truly eye-opening. Um, but I also one of the books that I relied on heavily was this book by a Dutch historian named Jacob Presser. That is a book called "The Destruction of the Dutch Jews," which was a classic text of Dutch history, which I'm of course sure that you know. And I was really unprepared for the experience of reading this book, which is like no history book I have ever encountered before, because Presser is writing it as a witness himself to these events. His wife was deported and murdered at Sobibor. He himself survived the war in hiding. And then after the war, he had access to archival materials and other documentation that he used to put together this extraordinary book that is also an extraordinary indictment of the Dutch, of the Dutch Jews who he accuses of collaborating as part of the Jewish Council. And so it's a book of history, but in which he can't help but allow his own voice to appear more than once in these emotional moments in the book. And I found that found that incredibly powerful.
Mm.
In terms of, the works of art, so I did kind of, as I was working on this book, I kind of collected different examples of different ways in which people had used Anne. I had a Google alert on my computer for her name whenever it turned up. And, I'll say, just between us here, you wouldn't believe the kind of dreck that this Google alert regularly turned up. Often and when Anne Frank's name is appearing on Twitter, it's usually not for a good reason. There's this Anne Frank Halloween costume that resurfaces every few years, and like restaurants get in trouble for naming dishes on their menus after her. I mean, it's truly sort of you have to laugh or you're going to cry at all the different ways in which Frank's name is used to sell everything from, makeup to who knows what else. But
The German train was one of the
German
worst.
train, yeah. Yeah, the German railway company actually thought of using Anne's name on a train as part of a group of famous German, luminaries who were going to be honored in this way. Apparently, they hadn't occurred to them how tasteless it was to honor her with a train of all things. But this Google alert did turn up a lot of very interesting things, I would say. I think my favorite work, or I think maybe the objectively best work of art inspired by Anne Frank is probably Philip Roth's novel The Ghostwriter, which I think is just it's not really about Anne herself. The novel imagines her having survived and encountering a writer who's a version of a young Philip Roth, in which he uses her as everybody who uses her in their art does. He uses her to play out his own preoccupations. She's a mirror on which he projects what he's most interested in, the problems that he is trying to work out. And for Philip Roth, that goes back to this question of universalism versus particularism. He is asking himself, to what extent is he always going to be a Jewish writer, or can he be an American writer? Is he always going to have that hyphen, the Jewish American, or can he be considered something, can he transcend his own group in this way? Speak with a larger voice. And of course, these are some of the same questions, the questions that have always arisen around the diary, questions that Anne herself is wrestling with, that she thinks of herself, as a Jewish person, but also as a Dutch person. She wants to be Dutch after the war is her great dream. But at the same time, she can't imagine not holding on to her Jewish identity that feels so important to her. And so, with that, as well as for Philip Roth, it's really sort of a both and question. As you put it before, Doyle, this is a false dichotomy to choose between the universal and the particular. It always has to be both, in whatever form that can take.
Mm.
Thank you. There's a powerful dialogue between Anne and Peter that she captures. And Peter, is imagining a life not being Jewish in the future. And it gets at that idea that I think is hard to grapple with, that identity is embraced and inflicted. And it was the kind of inflicted Jewish identity, which was a racial identity, that the Nazis used to categorize people, even people who didn't regard themselves as Jewish, and murder them. But the embraced identity that Anne had in understanding herself as Jewish is another kind of thing. And I was curious, because you made such an effort to get to know the real Anne behind, all the legend and everything else. And that girl evolved from the 13-year-old who went into hiding to the 15-year-old who was arrested. Did you see an evolution in her in that time in relation to her own Jewish identity, for example?
That's a really interesting question. I think it's hard to talk about the evolution of her Jewish identity just because there is so little specifically about that in the diary. In terms of religious observance, for instance, we don't see much of that. There are only a few entries that touch on specific, Jewish rituals. I think what we do see evolving is her reliance on God, the extent to which God occupies her thoughts in hiding. And this was another surprise for me, that when she's thinking about God, and talking about God with Peter, it's not, her conception of God isn't really a Jewish conception of God, but it's more of this sort of, pan, God in nature. She imagines, very poignantly, she imagines being able to go outside and, lie in a field and look up at the sky and feel God's presence. And she's trying to recreate something of that, even in the annex, to the extent she can, by just looking through the window. She imagines, but I think she's imagining being in touch with something larger than herself, a force of life, a force of love, that this is part of what is keeping her going, what's sustaining her there. It's a religious feeling. We could say it's a spiritual feeling, maybe more than a religious feeling. And, it's almost not an especially Jewish way of thinking about God, but something, again, that feels more universal, that connects her with humanity as a whole.
Right. We're actually going to go a couple minutes over with the consent of our guests. So hang in. This is obviously a very important and interesting conversation. We have a couple questions from the audience, and it relates a little bit about the writing about Peter that did or did not end up appearing. So the question is, didn't Otto do some editing specifically about her relationship with Peter and also about her becoming a woman? Was that significant?
Yes. So Otto did do some editing. And, for anybody who is really interested in these questions of the editing of the diary, I do encourage you to look at my book, which has a whole chapter about Anne's edits to the diary, as well as a chapter about the way Otto edited the diary. My short answer is that he edited the diary much less than he is generally thought to have. There's a perception that he removed Anne's criticisms of her mother, for instance, as well as her thoughts about her developing body. In most cases, this is simply not true. There were instances in which the Dutch publisher who originally published the book took out some of the stuff about puberty, and including that passage about Anne wanting to touch her friend's breasts, which then Otto insisted on being reinstated in the original English language edition of the diary, in controverting these more conservative Dutch publishers. Now, with the one exception is with Anne's relationship with Peter. That is the only instance of the really, really major editing that Otto did, which is that when Anne edited the diary, she took out her relationship with Peter. That was not a part of the way she wanted to present herself to the world. Of course, we have no idea why. She may have felt that it was too personal. She may have felt that it detracted from the focus of her diary as a testimonial document about Jewish persecution. We don't know. But Otto, read these entries in the original version and made the choice to reinstate them in the version of the diary that he published. And of course, as readers, this is such an important part of Anne's story, right? It adds so much light to it. It's such a sweet romance, and certainly it's an important part of what makes Anne feel so identifiable, right? She's not just a Jew in hiding under these extraordinary circumstances, but she's a teenage girl just like all other teenage girls who, has a crush and, falls in love. So, we don't know why Otto decided to put that back in, but speaking as an editor, it seems like it was a good choice.
Yeah. So I want to end on this notion of her becoming such an icon, right? Ruth, you write in your book, she is no longer just a young girl budding into womanhood, writing to make a sense out of cruel confinement, but has become a patron saint of adolescence, an ardent feminist, a literary prodigy, a champion of religious and racial equality, and an embattled literary property. So not only has she been used, misused, you talk a little bit about the commercialization and some of those rather absurd Google alerts that you got, and distressing ones, I would say as well. But I want you both to reflect on how you explain this both initial popularity of how this diary took off so amazing in such amazing ways, and how did that evolve into this enduring legacy? Doyle, why don't you go first?
Well, why don't you give me a softball short question?
Let's just wrap up quickly.
That's right. So we'll be here until tomorrow. It's a wonderful question. It's extraordinary that this book swept the world, really. And my own feeling about it is, how many human beings in your life do you get to know as intimately as you get to know Anne? She was desperate for a close friend and kind of revealed herself in her letters to Kitty and then her rewriting, with extraordinary openness and frankness, and the whole range of human emotions. So there's a lot to relate to there, and I think very few of us ever get to know very many people as closely as we feel we get to know Anne when she confides in us as so generously as she does. I personally suspect that was a big part of why she's touched so many people.
Hmm.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I would just add to that it's not just as an icon of adolescence that she's touched so many people, but also, of course, there are many people in the world who have suffered persecution and look to her as inspiration under those circumstances. And those are also among the stories that I collected in this book, from an amazing story about an Eritrean refugee who encountered her diary in an Ethiopian refugee camp and decided to translate it into his native tribal language so that his fellow Eritreans could read it, to Japanese after World War II, who apparently who made the diary extremely popular in Japan, as a document, it seems primarily of adolescence, but also to the anti-apartheid activists in South Africa who read her diary on Robben Island and later talked about how she had been an inspiration to them while they were in prison. To a couple years ago, that I heard a story on NPR about Afghan girls who were reading the diary and taking sustenance from them to them in their situation. So I think it is testament to Anne's, not just to her relatability, but to the genuineness of the diary as a document. The way it feels so authentic. It feels so real. It is the thoughts of a teenager, and teenagers and other young people, and people who are suffering from political persecution. This document has just been able to transcend linguistic boundaries, transcend national boundaries, and has become a kind of beacon of light in the wilderness to people around the world.
Mm. Well, I think that is a very poignant note on which to end. And I really want to thank you both so much for really this enlightening and engaging and important and timely conversation. Before we end, I want to encourage everybody to check out our chat box, because there are links to learn more about both of our guests and their work, including links to buy Ruth's book, a website on Doyle Center, as well as the New York exhibit. Lots of good information there. We will also be sending out an email tomorrow with some of this information, including links to Ruth's book and the center information. And I want to share a few notes on upcoming events and also share the news that we are rebranding the Hadassah Magazine programs. So from now on, we will be coming to you under the heading Hadassah Magazine Presents. We'll still be offering the high-quality author interviews and panel discussions you have come to respect and enjoy, only the title is changing. So our next two upcoming programs will be on March 20th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. We will be in conversation with Dara Horn, the 3-time National Jewish Book Award winner, about her latest work, the Passover set graphic novel, One Little Goat. But of course, we'll also address her expertise on the question of anti-Semitism, which was covered in her essay collection, People Love Dead Jews, from 2021. And on April 24th, Thursday, April 24th at 7 p.m., we'll be focused on the achievements of remarkable Jewish women through the ages. Panelists will include Julie Esther Silverstein and Tammy Schlossberg Brewer, co-authors of Chutzpah Girls, 100 Tales of Daring Jewish Women. This is one of several new anthologies that are out that share the stories of important Jewish women, including, of course, no surprise to our audience, Hadassah founder Henrietta Zold. She's one of 4 people that appears in every one of these anthologies. So we're encouraging you to bring your children, your teenage children and grandchildren to join the conversation. As always, a big thanks to Libby Barnea, our deputy editor, who helped plan this program, and to the magazine's digital editor, Ariel Kaplan, who both promoted and produced it. And a shout out to our partners in the engagement and marketing divisions, who are always instrumental with the details involved in making these events happen. And again, a huge thanks to our guests, Ruth and Doyle, for sharing your insights with us and for the work that you do. I want to give you the opportunity to say goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lisa, for having me here. I see there are still a few more questions in the Q&A, so I would just encourage anybody to check out my website. I have a Substack newsletter that has a lot of information about Anne Frank. In addition to the book, you may find answers to your questions there.
Yes, and I do apologize that I couldn't get to all the questions that came a little later. Doyle.
More good material. Yes. Thank you. This was really a treat. I enjoyed it very much. Go buy Ruth's book. I see many questions about the New York exhibition. It's fabulous. Try to get there if you can. It will circulate for several years, but you don't have to wait for that either. We have 18 traveling exhibits. It doesn't have the same artifacts, but we'll bring them to your school. So if you're interested, get in touch and we can talk about that. Thank you so much. Really a treat.
And if people are interested, should they contact you through the center information that we're providing?
That's right. You see my last name there. It's Stevick at sc.edu or stevick@gmail.com. Happy to receive inquiries and questions. And thank you for your interest.
Yeah. And lastly, I want to announce the lucky person who will receive a complimentary copy of Ruth's book. And that winner is Daphne Grant. Daphne, hopefully you're with us still, and you will hear from Ariel about how to actually receive the book. So thank you all for registering. Thank you for being here. I know it was meaningful, again, on this very important day and this important topic. I thank everyone for joining us, and I encourage you to become a Hadassah member if you're not already one, and to support the important work that Hadassah does. And I look forward to seeing you all next time. Goodbye.